shift places here, if you don't mind.
How hard is it to remember
Councilor
a
Meany
password?
is about 2 minutes late, but he's quite familiar with this material. We spent the last,
Are you gonna stand there?
I am.
I'm not sure that's happened
a little
in 3
weird.
years.
It's a little weird.
You want me to just do it from there?
Can you state your name and address?
For the record?
So the last few days, Rick and Robert and the Mayor Pro Tem and myself have kind of worked out. There were 2 things that we came out of the retreat, promising that we'd come back shortly after the retreat. One was, there was a quick conversation about sort of updating goals, and wanted to sort of firm up what that precisely meant and give a little more detail to that. And we'll come back to that in a moment. And the second was laying out a work plan. And we thought it was important to go through the work plan in some detail to get buy-in from the council, at least that there was comfort all the way around with that. Great, thanks, Rick. So you will be, you're provided hard copies that have detail, and basically the detail of that work plan has just been busted out in the PowerPoint presentation. So on the goals piece, the first was, the idea I was proposing, and I think the Mayor Pro Tem concurs with, was of there were some 27 objectives out of the several goals, rather overwhelming, but to focus or give council direction to the mayor and the staff or the administration in the remainder of 2020 was to take the top 10 goals or objectives, prioritize on 5 of those, and the rationale and logic was to essentially do ones that really pertain to the business at hand, that pertain to the work plan. So we thought it'd be better to go through the work plan and the flow and then come back to that goals conversation in a little bit. But the 2 things we want to achieve in the roundtable tonight is, again, to get some buy-in of the majority of the council on the goals and then on the work plan. So the first, starting in March, the first focus that we would want to do is a dive in on basically it's a lot of foundational budget stuff, is looking at existing revenue over a 6-year projection with fund balances. Primarily, this is on the general fund or general operations. And then, so basically it's taken the slide chart that you had seen Robert present at the retreat that showed the 2 lines with the gap opening up over the 6-year period. And then going into more detail, the first evening that we would take, in fact, it might take more than 1 evening, is just doing a deep dive into the details of revenues. What are the projections? What are the major revenue sources, whether it's property taxes, retail tax, utility tax and so forth, and what are all the limitations and tools that you can use around those, and what are all Robert's assumptions in that in terms of projections, and make sure the council's kind of comfortable with all those assumptions and can kind of probe and challenge with all those assumptions there. And then the key would be doing this on the next series of evenings, going again through March and April. Most of these slides, this whole part is consuming all of March and April, would be then shifting to the expense part of that same graph that Robert had done, and doing the same deep dive into that expense line. Departments, programs, shared and allocated costs, key assumptions included in all the expenses. And what sort of conservative estimates, is he 10% conservative, 15, 20, and make sure kind of policy-wise that the council's comfortable with the assumptions that are made on the expenses as well. And this is primarily, this isn't so much on we're not throwing any, this is basically a status quo with a lot of existing operations, existing revenue, and it's not throwing in a lot of new bells and whistles. One of the additional wrinkles on the expense one, of course, is I'll come back to this in a bit, is the level of services issue, and one is, can we find places to cut costs or trim? But the flip side of that is, I think we want to update. There's a few data points we used. You can see this was one back before the levy lid lift in 2017 to kind of get into showing you the trends in our staffing over the last decade or so. And we need to do updates on these metrics so we can give you back metrics to you. This is one, for example, that shows the growth of staffing in every department over this, 8 or 9 year period, with whether it's finance administration, police, fire, the parks and public works, community development, and all the other departments there. And you can see it's not been a rocket, a dramatic growth, but the dashed line here represents the sort of the FTE per 1,000 population. So as the population has been growing, it's how many staff per 1,000 of population do you have? And you can see the trend line's largely going down or at best flattening. And so these are, we want to try to do as much as possible, to provide some metrics and data to the council to make some determinations on appropriate levels of service. And one of the conclusions might be that we actually have a deficit or are falling behind or need to do some catching up. Here's another graph where, again, these are just two examples of some metrics we can use. This is one we started measuring back in 2001. The green bar shows the overall growth of the city in the population growth. The blue bar shows the calls for service, which actually started to plummet or come down as the ridge was approaching full build-out, probably indicative of a changing demographic. Yeah, it could be argued here that and we froze, and this was analyzed in part because we froze. We were growing officers, particularly to do 2 officers 24/7 in the city. We had to increase by 7 officers. And then the question was, should we keep growing the police department in relation to the growth of the population? And my contention was, no, we needed to freeze it. And then we watched some of this data as the officers, you can see it was about 4 officers per 1,000 population back in 2001. And as we froze that growth of the department, yet the population went up, the FTE per 1,000 started to drop.
Can I ask a question?
I'm sorry?
Can I ask a question?
Yeah.
So where is North Bend Police in this graph?
Well, it wasn't in here. That's what I mean. North Bend Police came online about 2015. So I'm just saying that I'm giving you a couple examples of some of the kind of metrics and data that this council has not had the advantage of seeing or looking into and probing to make more informed decisions about sort of expenses, staffing levels, and things like that.
Why would calls, I'm just trying to figure out why calls would go down as population goes up. I mean, I have a sort of a snarky response, which is everything's reported on Facebook now, but I'm just curious as to, I mean, a tree's down in I-90 and literally somebody asks what am I supposed to do?
Yeah,
That
no,
was posted on Facebook.
this, if you looked at a lot of FBI data, you find that that cities that have a higher than average education level or per capita income tend to have lower crime rates or sort of calls and whatnot. So as that demographic shifted in Snoqualmie dramatically with the growth of Snoqualmie Ridge, we started seeing the crime rates in general start to drop. And so it was that kind of a shift. But go ahead, Councilor Mayhew.
No, I was just going to say, I think this slide and the questions that it generates is exactly making the point of why the idea is that this ought to be in our work plan, is that in each of the departments, there is this kind of information and these kind of relationships. And as we kind of think ahead to the next biennium, especially in a biennium where things are different than they've been for a while in terms of what's happening with the revenue, what's happening with population growth, it's time to maybe refresh ourselves on exactly what are these key statistics in each of the departments, what are kind of the drivers, and there's probably a fair amount of work. So just talking about police, we have those questions. Every department we might have similar questions, and just getting ourselves back up to speed is kind of what is being proposed in this March, April time when we look at level of service and are we satisfied or aren't we satisfied and so on, is that there's probably a fair amount of work for us to do.
Yeah. So, I mean, I think it's a great question Councilmember Shepherd asked about the North Bend Police contract, because as you can imagine, a different demographic was introduced again into this sort of metric. And I wouldn't be surprised if we didn't see that blue bar start to crawl back upward again. As with our population continuing to grow, we start seeing the red line flatten into about 1 officer per or full-time officer per 1,000 population, which now is getting, starting to get below a sort of metric you would see in many communities of our size. And so, and then that would give you a clearer picture. And we're just trying to introduce more metrics and information so the council isn't just sort of intuitively grasping at what's an appropriate level of service. Councilmember Ross?
So these go through 2015, so you're just showing us.
These are just
potential
examples of just to give you an idea of why some of these evenings are going to consume a lot of time, why I'm going to fill your calendars up with roundtables or long council meetings, because there's a lot of ground we need to cover that we did not have the advantage of doing in the last couple of years. But actually, I think as you'll see, we'll tie back to your goals. And then picking up again, then the dialogue would go again from after we sort of laid out what the challenges are, then it's pivoting to that. What are the tools at your disposal? What are the potential solutions? And whether it's looking at economic development, then we would want to, again, as I said at the retreat, use this as sort of the foundation of our conversations and focus. It's the levels of service, economic development, and raise fees and taxes. Those are the only three major buckets or tools that you have to work with in order to adjust costs or to to address a deficit, for example. And I won't go through all these because this is not an all-inclusive list. These are simply examples I just threw up here to give you an idea of what I mean by economic development. If we can't drop levels of service to save costs, or you're not willing to raise taxes and fees, this might be the only option at your disposal, is to pursue more growth or development in order to bring in new and additional revenue. And of course, the thing I want to make clear again, if you're not willing to do all three of those, then I would be more concerned that, again, that's utopia. That doesn't exist. You can't pretend that things are going to not fall apart dramatically and drastically by taking no action in all three of those areas. Again, potential solutions in taxes and fees. Again, just about 5 examples up there. The 0.2% sales tax to replace the TB funding, or double that even. Maybe the council says, no, we're really at a new normal where the majority of this council says no on 1% tax increases, but they're comfortable letting the voters decide. So every 2 or 3 years, you throw a modest levy lid lift out there and let the voters decide if they want to make those service adjustments, or adjustments to keep service levels the same, or to address service deficits, gas tax, ed tax, and so forth. And then the one that we did not do as much of a deep dive in during the retreat was the levels of service issue, and that's trying to address how to look for efficiencies or cost savings internally from departments, whether it's staffing levels, programs, activities, and projects. Looking at the revenue allocation, what precisely, we've had a lot of debates that sometimes gets us high-centered on trying to determine exactly when a cost is an ongoing operational cost versus a capital cost, or is it an ongoing capital cost, or is it a one-time capital cost? And we lack some maybe consensus or clarity around those that gets us kind of hamstrung on moving forward. And so this, again, it's going to be rather time-consuming. And again, I'll be intending to fill up a lot of meetings in the future to be laser-focused on getting through what can be, I think, a lot of great discussions and information, but it can be very time-consuming to get through that. And again, allocation of capital revenues by areas, looking at the fund balances and the reserves. What are restricted funds by council? I mean, where do you have some latitude? Funds that might be put in a bucket, like on, say, Jeannie Hansen Park or the Meadowbrook Bridge, and you think it's in a lockbox, but that's a council action of the past. You could say, well, let's unlock those monies and allocate it somewhere else. But what monies might be restricted by state law that you don't have the ability to move around? It's like domestic. Well, I forget some of the funds that come from policing. And can't be used on general fund purposes. And then another huge bucket within the levels of service is, of course, all the non-utility CIP pieces. Looking at a bit of a this is not a complete remake of it, but we need to revisit the non-utility CIP list, which you just spent time going through and having great conversation around. And this conversation is probably going to lead us to say we need to revisit that. Maybe there's some things we need to shave off of there, or just prioritize and be more realistic about what we can or cannot achieve given the new limitations due to like that perfect storm I described at the end of 2019 in terms of loss of capital revenues and loss of ongoing operational revenues. And identify additional project funding sources and then align that with the project spending. Same with programs, and then part of the thought with the Mayor Pro Tem was to initially present some of this information to the Parks and Public Works Committee to at least do a little bit of the groundwork before bringing it back to council for further deliberations. And of course, the importance of that is, again, there's going to be a lot on your plate to get through in the coming months. And again, this is over 2 months what we're shooting for here. And then the final piece, of course, would be at the end of all that conversation, getting some sort of council endorsement or a thumbs up or thumbs down from at least the majority of the council on policy choices and strategies. Again, which of those tools in the 3 toolboxes do you want to use? What combination of those? You sort of are picking from the menu and you put together your a la carte menu and said, this is the majority of the council is saying this is the general direction that we want you, administration, to go to address this problem and this challenge. And hand in hand with that, of course, is approving a revised 2021 or 6-year non-utility CIP, along with approving one for the biennium non-utility CIP for the biennium budget. And then a quick revisit of the goals at that time. I mean, we're doing a quick touch on it right now, but I think at the end of all that too, it's again revisiting those goals. And what I think is important by that when I say that is it feasible solving all this to still do for, to aggressively spend hundreds of thousands of dollars or millions of dollars on a tourism, and again, I'm using these purely as examples, tourism plan, community center, affordable housing and whatnot. At that point, I think we can come back and revisit some of those new initiatives or other projects that we've been working on that I've frankly directed the staff to put on hold for the time being. By the time we get into May, I think we'd be very fortunate if we were still in April by the time we got here, but now by April, May, we're finally able to give to Robert the more traditional beginning of a biennium budget process. Hopefully this is going to go, this should go fairly smoothly then at this point if we've done all that foundational work and sort of got good direction from the council, because it's not going to be a year where Bob Larson and I or the city administrator are struggling with a big $1 million enhancement list that we have to weed down and go through. There's not going to be many, if any, enhancements in this, or very few. And then, you know, all of us or the staff should have a clear idea of just what direction we're going to put this budget together and bring that back to you for presentation. So in light of that, then it gives an opportunity come May, June to pivot into what has to go hand in hand as we prepare for a budget at the end of the year. And that is shifting out of the general fund to this, our utilities or enterprise funds. And by May or June, it would be a conversation about the utilities capital improvement plan and operating budget. We would, you know, do general presentation about the system needs and proposed plan. Again, the proposed utility, same sort of revisitation of what's the 6-year CIP for the utilities infrastructure. And then, again, Mayor Pro Tem's thought was to give that to the Parks and Public Works Committee for some preliminary work and kind of hash that out before bringing it to the council, at least to save some time and create some efficiencies. The following right behind that has to be the more difficult conversation for the council in June going into August, which is basically working with the consultant to do the utility rate study on the capital funding plan and rate setting. So it's, again, doing that projection. Our last 3-year cycle of doing rate increases is coming up. When is it, Robert? After end of next year? Or?
The rate increases, this is the last
Yeah,
year.
so this is the last year. So come 2021, the question is, what are going to be the new rates, or does it just flatten at that point? If it flattens at that point, there's going to be some serious consequences to the investments needed to be made in the utilities and commitments made there to continue to aggressively get after rebuilding downtown infrastructure and attending to quickly aging infrastructure on Snoqualmie Ridge. Again, and then we would be coming back following out of that consultant rate study with proposed rates to the city council. Another example of what would be considered in there is, do we want to take some relief off of the general fund by working into the stormwater utilities a small fee for taking care of street trees, for example, as we know we have massive costs facing with street trees that are popping sidewalks up and need to be corrected, of some 9,000 trees. And again, Mayor Pro Tem was suggesting we would direct some of this work through the F&A committee to do some preliminary work prior to bringing it to full council. And then again, back to in June, August, the biennium budget, administration presentation of proposed biennium budget, council discussion, recommendation by department associated committees to council, and then we would again have public hearings on the biennium budget process and the adoption of the biennium budget. Our general kind of nodding that that's going in the right direction. And of course, through August, September, it would be concluding the utility rates, doing on the work plan of the calendar, we'd have to have opportunities for public communications, outreach, public hearings, and then adoption of the utility rate increases for the ordinance. So if we've really been cruising along by October, November, we're ready to wrap things up with, moving into approving the property tax levy ordinance, whether you want to take the 1% or not, potentially bond issuance documents on utility, because we were always talking about that second round of doing a bond issuance on the utilities because those utility needs, and is the council still prepared to move forward on pulling the trigger on that and approve utility rates corresponding to that as well, and then approval by Finance Administration Committee and Council. All right, so we're cruising along on time pretty good. Any questions or discussion about the work plan before I do a brief comment on goals? Does that seem like a pretty, well, like I said, we had a lot of robust conversations. What's that?
Seems quite aggressive.
Yes. Now you understand my.
Yeah. I'll be interested to see how we schedule all of that and how we get that actually happening.
Right. Yeah, so if we get by off on this work plan, then we're going to go back working with Mayor Pro Tem too, and we're going to actually start plugging in dates. And I think to be on the conservative side, we're going to just queue up roundtables. We're going to see both meetings in March or have roundtables. We might even consider throwing some into the committee of the whole to cover some ground. If it seems like we're moving through it quite efficiently, then maybe we can be a little more optimistic and say, well, maybe we don't need a roundtable, we can fit it into some, if we have some council. It's unfortunate, like the first meeting in February was a pretty light agenda. It's too bad we didn't take advantage of an hour or so there of a conversation like this. So if we see opportunities then coming up in April or even in March to throw some of this conversation into the regular council meeting, or as Brian and Bob can attest to, we've often done special council meetings. I know you're not thrilled to do that per se, but we sometimes call special council meetings so you can devote, a full two or 3 hours to
I
it.
think one of the advantages, Mr. Mayor, you have is that you have a council of all 7 members who went through the budget process last time.
Yeah.
And are familiar with the challenges we had with that.
Yes.
And hopefully we can find streamlining and put that together so we're not churning on things that we don't need to be churning on. We're focused on the policies and the decisions and those
Yeah,
sorts of things.
I won't varnish it over. That was probably one of the most painful and dysfunctional budget processes I ever went through. It didn't serve anyone well because I think the council's been lacking this foundational work and information to really inform your thinking about the challenges that we were facing. And what I think by laying out this work plan in detail, what we hope to, I'll make no bones about it, our intention, and I say our, I include the Mayor Pro Tem, is to make sure that we are reminding each other as we sort of suddenly go off on trails on some less priority items. It's not to say that those issues aren't important. It's kind of remind ourselves, do we really have time for that? Given what's on our plate, and just calling all of ourselves back to account for what we have to accomplish and cover in the next few months. Councilmember Shepherd?
One thing I'd like us to do for this go-around is to maybe ahead of, at the beginning of the year, check with all of our council calendars and see if there's a particular nth day of the month or.
Oh, that we could just calendar and grab?
Well, just for us to set aside in our personal calendars so
Yeah.
that if we want to schedule something, it's not a big tug of war.
So you're thinking a special meeting where we could devote
Well,
2 or
just to
3
set-
hours to?
Maybe just a timing just for us to set aside in our calendars to anticipate being able to schedule a meeting in that time.
Well, at this point, we're already warning you to go ahead and schedule, assume 6 o'clock for the next 2 council meetings, because we're going to do roundtables and they're queuing up revenues and expenses. What I'm hearing you asking, though, and proposing to the rest of the council is, do you want to consider that we just go ahead and grab some dates well ahead of time? That way they're on the calendar, they're blocked out in your calendars, and we can always pull them off to set aside time to perhaps do a special council meeting, maybe one a month, that where you could devote 2 or 3 hours to this conversation and getting through this material.
That would be fine, yeah.
Okay. Am I getting a thumbs up on that? Everybody's okay?
Sure.
Yeah, I
Okay.
think,
It'll have to depend on, calendars.
We'll shoot toward the end of, starting toward the end of the month or March, because I don't think with the first week or so would be realistic at this point. But Jody could do a doodle poll or something like that to just get an idea of like you see, a 4th Thursday of the month or something okay.
No, and any 5th Monday is fair game.
That's a great point. So we'll definitely shoot for 5th Mondays.
and
Thank
we
you,
have one
Councilmember.
in March, so that's what and we have one
All
in
right,
June.
so assume we have a meeting already scheduled in March, the 5th Monday in March. So those are precious breaks to give up, but yeah. Councilmember Ross?
So I think it's a nicely laid out plan, and kind of gives us heads up as to what we're going to be doing between now and November. When we did the last budget session, in November, when we did the last budget session, I don't know that we even started until August, so we're already about 5 months ahead, so.
Yeah, no, that's a great point. And to Councilmember Lasay's point too, we're precisely trying to avoid the greatest enemy that made that budget process so painful a year and a half ago was time. We jumped on it way too late in the year, and it was just a setup for nothing but monumental frustrations on all parts, and just led to mistakes where people rushing information at the last minute, trying to make changes and all that. So we're trying to get way out ahead of this. And again, even at the time that we would start the typical budget conversations 2 or 3 months ahead, but at least prior to that, we'd be doing a lot of foundational conversations. And Councilmember Say, to your point, we are trying to build an aggressive schedule, knowing that, knowing us, it's probably, by the time we're done with this, it'll have slipped by a month. But unless we do it aggressive, we want to have some cushion in here. So, Councilmember Sewell?
So, May, June, and August are our 5th Mondays. So
Okay.
the reason I call that out, March, June, and August are 5 Mondays. And the reason I make that statement is because I want to make sure, there's only so much we're going to accomplish from 6 to 7, right? A lot of that is listening, and being presented to. But I just want to make sure that and being presented to. But I just want to make sure that we all know that March, June, and August, those meetings, those 3 or 4 hour meetings have to be like, we got to get stuff done.
Yeah.
So my question is, in 4 weeks from now, in that March 5th Monday, I'd like the administration to really be aware that, like, that's a huge day, right? And so
Yeah.
we need to have some set of information that we can walk out of that meeting, ideally, having moved the boulder up the hill a significant amount. And so I don't know what those are. I know Mayor Pro Tem probably has a pretty good idea, but I just want to make sure we don't waste those things, that we just plan on 3 or 4 hours on those 5th Mondays, but that we actually walk out something done. Like, what's the goal of the March 5th Monday, right? And the June 5th Monday. My hunch is that if we stick to your schedule, that 5th August Monday might be the crossing Ts and dotting Is if we stick with your schedule of having the
Yeah.
final budget done at the end of August,
That'd be
right?
great,
But I
yeah.
just want to make sure we have, that those are well-structured and not just, as we tend to do, as I'm doing right now, just talking ad nauseum and not getting anything done.
Well, to that point, I mean, part of my strategy has been to say to leave some latitude, not to precisely peg down the topic and night, because I don't want to put the council in a position where we say, hey, we got one night for revenues, and you get into that night and you feel like, we need another night or maybe half a night for revenues. So we have to be flexible to adjust to that. But I like the point you're saying, if we don't put some kind of targets on it, it's kind of like the freeway. You build it bigger and it's just going to fill up. Leave too much time, and we give. In other words, we could give 4 weeks of revenues, and we'll figure out a way to talk for 4 weeks about revenues, which might be unnecessary. So we might find that it's going very efficient and fast, and we can jump ahead of things.
So, everything that the mayor just presented on his slides is on the one, it's sort of a front and back,
2 pages. Yeah.
two pages, work plan. And this is, I guess the thing I'd sort of suggest to all of us is, I agree with everything that's just been said. I would say we're going to have to do we have to realize one thing, we have to do 2 big things. The thing we have to realize is a lot of this process is something the administration, as we sit here right now, can't do. Because we have to make some decisions to guide them. Okay? So if we said, bring us every possibility of ways to find revenue for the city, we only have 110 or so employees. We'd need 1,000 employees to do that. So every possibility can't be brought to us. So what they can do is bring us the possibilities that they think are on the radar that make the most sense from their perspective, and we have specific proposals. So this is very interactive, and there's a lot of work by us. So that's, I think, a thing, that we need to realize. I think if we can, what I've been pushing this idea, and if you all don't agree with this, I'm looking for your buy-in now. I've been pushing the idea that a reasonable amount of this work can be done by us in our committees. Not that the committees can make decisions for all of us, but that the committees can probably do a pretty good job of anticipating the questions that the council will have and trying to guide conversations and help staff, sort of guide staff, so that by the time that we're a committee of the whole and considering things, we're kind of got a leg up. And maybe some of the council members who've been on a committee that are spending time with something are able to relate to us some of the conversations we've already had. Hey, at council, at committee, we went down this path, we kind of considered these, this is kind of what we found out, and that might help all of us move a lot quicker. At committee, we went down this path, we kind of considered these, this is kind of what we found out, and that might help all of us move a lot quicker, and also help cut down the amount of time when we're all together that the administration is just talking at us, and we're trying to then figure things out that maybe the committee's already figured out some of that for us. So I've sort of pushed the idea that, especially for the next 3-4 months, a significant amount of our committee time is going to probably be spent on some of the prep work to keep this budget moving. And I had a second thing and I've forgotten it. Should have written it down. So I'm just, I think you see from this a lot of thought went into kind of putting together a work plan that really lays everything out. With your endorsement of this, or with whatever changes or modifications you want to make, then exactly what, I don't know if it's Councilmember Shepherd or Sunwell that, or who it was that mentioned, we're then going to go really drive out, okay, what happens specifically, what presentations are made, committee of the whole, at individual committees, what dates, and we'll be able to see very well the next month and a half, and then as we move through each of the weeks, we'll be able to see a little bit farther, and we'll just keep driving out a lot more detail, and the committee chairs in particular will kind of get the information about, here's what we need you to focus on in your committees during these upcoming sessions. And you'll get information as to, okay, yep, it looks like we are going to have a committee of the whole that night, or we aren't, et cetera. So we really want to drive this process and looking for your kind of nod to, or green light that this is how to go forward.
Well, not just drive it, we really spend a lot of time rehashing and reworking it a multitude of times to really get it down in a way that's highly digestible and understandable, not just for the council, but for a member of the public coming in and going, what are they talking about in this complexity of how a general fund works? And just breaking it down into all these component parts and creating kind of a framework like that Venn diagram so everybody's starting to, we need to kind of develop a new common language with the council administration about, when you say certain terms or describing certain things, we are using the same definitions or understandings, and I think that's where things will start working more smoothly. All right. Any other questions on that then?
So I guess
Or just
I'm interpreting silence as being
complicit?
approval. So
Yeah, I don't.
if that's
I mean,
wrong, tell us.
It's a we don't have a choice. I mean, there's not 13 months in 2020. So, I mean, I don't know what I would object to. We don't get to push this back any further. So
the whole
thank you
process-
for outlining it well so I can sort of digest it. But I don't know how we would really change anything on this substantively.
Yeah, the whole process in my mind is kind of a SWOT analysis. It's with the first weeks really focused on what are our weaknesses and threats, and then pivoting to that solutions. What are the opportunities and strengths that we can work on to help address those weaknesses and threats? But again, just laying it out in a way that's very digestible in terms of how we take this complexity and simplify it and focus it in a way we can kind of talk off the same page. Councilmember Shepherd?
So basically, this is your proposal, and then we digest it and see how we feel about it, and maybe make tweaks if there's opportunities to do that. As far as scheduling, earlier is better after last year. Or
That's our
the last
approach, yeah.
Budget cycle. So, I have nothing to give you other than, one thing I would like to see that I haven't heard is I would like to see 2 years' history of spending by department and some detail. That's one of the things that helps me process what I'm looking at, and if it's in the ballpark or not.
Yeah. Okay. You're talking about in the budget process or in the, well, okay, I think we typically do stuff like that, so that's not an issue. I think Robert planned to do a little of that benchmarking anyway, yeah. Any other comments
I
on
got
this?
the impression from comments you've made that that's exactly where you're thinking. I think that point just comes out of, I think in the last budget cycle, there were a number of times where we were looking at something and didn't feel like we had historical info. So
Right.
I think this
Well,
request fits with your
When I
plan.
use those two examples of levels of service, you can see we didn't just reach back 2 years. In some cases, we reached back, 8 or 10 years to look at that trend line in terms of what all those metrics were doing. So it's helpful to, and you can see we didn't do that out of thin air. It's because past council conversations got into these same difficult conversations about how do you make these decisions, and when everybody's sort of grasping for more of a sense of where things should be. So, and some are very hard to tackle and to determine exactly. It's hard to measure some of these issues, but we'll do our best. Councilmember LaSalle?
It's a caution. This is all this is that as a council, we've shown a pattern of when we discuss something in committee, we rediscuss it at council level. I would encourage us as we're doing this as those committees are doing the work and doing the research and diving into the information, that we don't rehash that at a council level again. And we maybe do a little bit more of a summary of what was going on. I know that as each committee chair does that and provides a short summary, but it's typically 30 seconds to a minute long. Maybe we have to spend more time with a bit of a type of presentation of this is what we went through, this is what we did, and then let's not rehash those decisions, or we have to make decisions at the council level, but let's not rehash those investigative methods, but use it as a point of starting as opposed to a point of reassessing. And I think we had a tendency to do that last time, and that's something we want to I think we'll have to stay away with this schedule, especially for the first 2 or 3 months. We'll be hard pressed to get through a lot of this.
Well, I think my staff can already attest the fact that I will be a nagging taskmaster over the next few weeks. I was leading up to this meeting, and will be to some degree with the council. And I'm asking to implore you to assist me in policing ourselves, and I mean me too, trying to find that appropriate balance between going into enough detail to get a good idea about just what are the challenges facing us, but not plumb so deep into details that we sort of get lost in the weeds and we're not getting the ball moved up the hill, as Councilmember Sunwall said, and moving forward.
And I guess let me throw one more thing on there. It also as an opportunity. If we're moving along and something is heading in the right path and we have an opportunity to not, let's say we're working on something on the April and May items that then shows up on a line in June and August, if we can finish it in April, May, let's finish it.
Yeah.
Let's not kick it down the road and say, well, we're going to get to that when it goes in front of the F&A committee. Well, let's get in front of the F&A committee now. If we can put a check mark on something, or if we can put it in front of Parks and Public Works ahead of time and get a check mark on something, let's do that. And try to take advantage of those opportunities when we see momentum happening. Let's continue to see momentum happening. I mean, we know when we're in that position, where we're all in agreement and we're all feeling like it's going forward, so.
Okay, I suspect in about 10 minutes it's going to start getting loud and noisy, and here's more people.
There's some medals.
So let's, I'll shift to the last piece we wanted to make sure we cover tonight. Well, at this point, I think, unless someone's giving me the stinky eye, I think we're getting what we need from the council, which is everybody seems on board and is buying into this work plan, saying, good to go, we're committed, okay? The second is just doing a quick revisitation of the council's goals and objectives that give us guidance for this work plan. And as I mentioned at the retreat, but you didn't have the material in front of you to look at, you'll see the copy of the full 27 rated ones on the matrix, so you can see the ones I dropped off there. But of the top 10, I basically took 5 of the top 10 that I thought pertained and were highly aligned with what we need to accomplish over the next 5 or 6 months. And so we don't have to go back and start. I know you're eager to redo goals and objectives all over again because that was so fun, but so we don't have to, redesign the wheel here. I think we can just take from a lot of that and say, council, here is what I am, as the mayor and administration are recommending, or saying, these are the objectives from you. We're going to, somewhat on those top 10s, ignore the exact rankings and just take these that pertain to the work we need to get done. And if you agree that these are the primary goals that we will be using. And as you go through and read those, and I just clip those out of there, establish capital spending plan for each department to include fleet, technology, utilities, transportation, facilities, and park. Again, that aligns with the work plan. Develop long-range revenue models and present to council with the present state and near future forecast. It was in your objectives. We didn't quite get there yet, but it highly aligns with the work plan. Create maintenance policies and prioritize department plans for all infrastructure categories. Again, highly aligned with the work plan. And then maintain existing service levels. And lastly, establish long-range financial plan by we can take that date out of there, by basically end of second quarter 2020 to include future considerations. And what I took out of there is, again, any kind of big initiative things that would, frankly, I think the council's in a position where you go, well, how do we know to even move forward on those initiative things or costly sort of initiatives if we don't have an understanding of the foundational budget challenges that are facing us? So we need to get reset and regrounded in those budgetal foundations, and then and at that point we can come back and, like I said, at the end of that process, revisit some of those goals to see what you want or willing to put back on the table. Okay. I was supposed to at this point turn it over to the Mayor Pro Tem.
So are we saying some of the goals are off the table until we
Oh, he's still here. Okay.
go through the budget process?
Well, not off the table. We're basically saying this is where we're going to focus. These 5 goals are what's going to drive the next 5 or 6 months for us. It's not to say that the other objectives or goals have been dismissed or thrown away. It's just saying these are the ones that we think are most relevant to focus on for the next 5 or 6 months. And at the end of that, that foundational process or into the budget process, then I think it's appropriate to come back and revisit some of those goals. Or let me put it this way. You have 2 pages of the work plan. The first page is about that kind of assessing the problems and challenges and then looking at all the potential solutions. And once there's some direction there, you have a better idea about what your resources are and tools. At that point, you can revisit the goals and priorities, because what's so relevant, what's so important about you doing it at that point is we need that conversation to then inform Robert going into the traditional budget process to know what should we be building back into that budget for that 2 years. Do we still want to put the tourism plan in there, $150,000 for an affordable housing plan? Are we still moving forward on a community center? So that's what I mean when I say that's the appropriate time to come back and reset those.
Catherine, I think another way to say it is those are the goals we'll accomplish by doing the plan. Whether we recite those 5 goals before the start of every meeting,
Right.
These are what we'll achieve by doing what we've talked about tonight.
Right.
Right. You got to get this done before you can achieve those other goals is what we're saying, another way of
Like
saying.
tourism plan and affordable housing was assigned to community development. So those things we should wait on until we've,
Yes, we're recommending that we just, for the sake of time, take those off of the agendas and conversations at committees and council meetings for the time being, get through this foundational work, and then we can come back. Because that informs whether you have the resources to actually execute on those or not, since we had a perfect storm at the end of 2019 that sort of changed our reality.
I think of these as the prerequisites for those other
Right.
wants and things that we want to attain for the community.
You can't make
This is
goals.
fiscal responsibility here. We got to do this.
Yeah, you can't make goals and priorities without a firm grasp on what resources do you have to achieve those goals and priorities. Councilmember Holloway.
Well, concur with, I guess, one caveat that I might be able to get talked out of, and that being, I view the pool community center as a significant issue that it does landscape shift against the financial plan, the revenue plan, if you consider in or out. So my question is, why is that given secondary, not in this first tranchant of things to discuss?
No, that's not saying it can't be devoid or absent in the conversations about sort of your challenges and fiscal challenges and all that. We will, when we get into the solutions portion, Robert will be running a number of scenarios with you, and we will have some ideas. I think we do have some ideas, even with all these challenges, where you can still achieve those goals. But what I can't predict right now is the council says to go to an extreme. You know what? We've changed our mind. We don't want to do the mill site, and we're sure as heck not going to pass the 1% for the next 6 or 8 years. Well, that quickly changes the equation and information for me to be able to think whether the community center is viable or not. I can pretty much give an answer pretty quickly. So, right. So that's what I mean when I say we got to get reset and get some, in that first foundational conversation, some general idea from the council about what direction, what things the majority of the council is willing to support and direction to the staff and administration to say, hey, we're definitely going to, mill site is a huge piece of the puzzle, or we're going to do levy lid lifts, or hey, now we see we're going to do 1%, or whatever those 0.2%, all those conversations need to inform us about going, or we would make suggestions to you to say, if you did X, Y, and Z, we still think we could accomplish Y. But I can't get there beforehand. We need to get into that conversation first. And I don't want to presume the council's still on board all these pieces and get everybody's kind of defenses up right out of the gates. Councilor Mayhew?
Yeah, just to amplify in the discussions and sort of coming up with this, and I think you can see this really clearly if you look at the one-page handout on goals. The idea was, as we discuss this, as we go through just setting the basic plan, what do we think the revenues are? What do we think it costs just to maintain existing service levels? What we thought was we need to get out of that conversation any sense of agendas beyond just that. So any kind of enhancement, whether it's a community center, whether it's a new river walk or anything that's above and beyond where we're at now, let's take that conversation after we've covered the basics and gotten comfortable about what our resources and demands are just to keep the city running. So it's not to say those won't come back on, but saying is first, let's take those first 6 goals and just focus on those as we go through this initial stage. And then once we got a handle on that, got a sense of what we can do with the operating budget, then we can see, okay, what do we think we really have for resources for additional things? And then we have those conversations, whether it's affordable housing, whatever it is.
Or conversely, if you feel like, we don't have resources, why don't we go back to that toolbox and see if there's 2 or 3 more things we want to pick in order to help make that happen? So that we just give you the ability to have to have all the tools and the language available to know what pieces of the menu you can pick to address those challenges.
So,
Councilmember Lassay and then Ross.
I'll defer to Ross first.
Go ahead.
okay, so
Still for discussion.
I just have a question about the pool then, because we sent you off the resolution to go find funding, and you've been working with the school district and the Y and other, and King County levy, things like that. And timing's of the essence on those things. So if we wait 5 months, then we may lose those opportunities.
Not necessarily. We have, I've been in a lot of those tough conversations because we're coming up on deadlines and grant applications. Staff's come in and say, well, should I still apply for this grant? And so I'm taking a little bit of risks on those. We haven't committed city funds or to projects, but I have said, you know what, let's submit the letter to King County per Kathy Lambert's discussion for $500,000 for the pool, for example. I haven't pulled back the conversation or requests from Senator Mullet or the state legislators on monies from the state. The delays that we're having actually align with where the school district is right now, so that's not been a problem. Is it going to cause potential delays on some of these projects, including the community center, of a month or maybe even a year, or a few months or a year? Yes, it could, but I'm not convinced it would compromise the potential funding just yet. Yeah, it's going to definitely create maybe some more risks than we would have preferred. But. Councilman Lassay?
That's all great points, and I'd love to figure out how we can do all that stuff. One of the things I do notice is on our goals, actually, this discussion draft is actually nice because it does just list stuff.
Right.
And it's easy to follow, and some of these might be able to be handed off to some of our boards and commissions as well. So they don't necessarily have to go static. We could look at finding the appropriate board and commission and tasking them with some of the things we might do and do some of that background work and background investigation work to find out if it's, and then we'll, by the time we get to that, maybe in October, November, December, January next year, there's been some movement on it. So not everything has to sit still. We'll have to figure out what that is, but we need to make time for that as a council to decide if we want to do that.
Are we going to have a break between now and?
Yeah, I was going to suggest, this has gone as smoothly as we could have hoped. Well, actually, Mayor Pro Tem, this is supposed to be your part of kind of facilitating.
Well, I was just going to say, just to be clear, at least my belief was that all of the objectives might still be being worked on and moved forward.
Right.
It's just that each one is going to take second, anything that's not in that first group takes second chair to anything that's in the first group. So as we have, to the extent we have time, we keep moving on all of them. But we've got to let's focus on those first 6. Let's ask administration to focus on those first 6. And then the others are as we have time to get to them. So I think they'll still move forward to some degree. I think that's consistent with what you were just saying, Mayor. And then
Yeah.
I guess I just want to say, knowing that we're pretty much out of time here, is there a sense from the council that you would endorse moving forward in the way that's being proposed here? Focus on these 6, the rest as we have time, as is available after focusing on those 6.
Yes.
Is there any disagreement with that?
I'm getting one disagreement here. Councilmember Holloway.
So again, we were talking taking $4 million out of the budget for the pool. You need to make a decision on that because it's going to drive a lot of your other decisions right off the bat. So I disagree with second tiering pool discussion.
What if we don't have 4 million?
How do we know if we have?
We discover in this budgeting process we don't have the 4 million. Brad.
Anymore. Well, what we'll do,
I think we can build
Councilmember
in
Holloway,
what's
this
being
is
asked.
kind of what Councilmember, it doesn't necessarily mean it's off the table. It means it's got to take second tier. We will be definitely looking at still keeping those pieces in there, affordable housing, tourism, community center, or pool. What it means is we just we just have to not be rigid about trying to force a square peg in a round hole if we found that we just can't find enough money to keep all those pieces together. And we'll run scenarios. We'll say, here's the,
I just reserve the right that as we get through the
no, I
conversation, I'm
appreciate
gonna
the
go,
I appreciate-
what about the pool?
I appreciate the
Or,
comment.
you know, does it brown the meat, or whatever?
Yeah. I appreciate the comments, and it's great. That helps inform us, because then because what we'll be doing is showing scenarios, and one of the questions we anticipate was, well, if this is status quo, does your status quo have a pool in it? And I didn't think that was very honest if we sort of assumed what you just described, put that into the base expenses, and someone goes, wait a minute, well, that's still a choice we could pull back on. Why are you treating it like status quo? So we have to be honest about what we're treating as status quo and what's not, and then run scenarios showing what things are in or out. Does that make sense? Okay. All right, so so with that, are you bought into this focus then on these goals?
I'm bought in, I met grouse later, but I'm bought in.
All right, thanks.
No May.
May comes after April.
All right, so that will, thank you,
find
council.
it in the
That's
schedule.
precisely where we need to get this evening. We'll adjourn the roundtable meeting, and we'll start precisely at 7 o'clock for the council meeting.
Thank you.
Thank you.
A tiger can't change his stripes.
You never know.
Maybe it's a leopard.
Something like that. Straight spots, I don't know, something like that.
There's something like that.